Hi, happy Bank Holiday Monday to everyone who worships Jesus of Nazareth. And my name's Brodie McLeod. Not worshipful or worthy of veneration, but great if you want some banal YouTube content that doesn't really get any views. I don't even watch these videos back myself, and I hope that those who do enjoy them, obviously. But anyway, I went to rehab in 2023, right? I was in hospital from January until about November, like really long, 10 months, something, 11 months. And I met these guys in the rehab who'd been there for like years, decades. They'd been in this rehab facility. And I guess I knew that detention under sections could be indefinite, but I never really considered that people, I've been in hospital now since July 2024. So July 25 is a year, it's what, April now, in another 12 weeks I will have been inside for 2 years. And that's just flown by. And I guess there's a general consensus from what I've picked up that people would almost rather do jail time than serve psychiatric detentions under section. Because with a prison sentence, you've got like an end point. Do you know what I mean? You've got a tangible exit date, and you don't have that with a psychiatric illness. You stay there for as long as they deem you are sufficiently unwell to meet the criteria to sustain the section. Bit like that film Terminator 2, you have to sort of come up with a plausible narrative to show that you're not mental and that anything you believe, which they don't deem to be based in evidenced truth or factual narrative, is therefore a delusion which you've had insight into. And they do this thing where they're like, if you're like, I don't want to take this medicine anymore because I don't really feel bad anymore, but they then say, no, it's because of the medication that you feel better, and that's why you have to stay here for another 5 years and be medicated, because we can't have you out in the community where you might not take your meds. Although there is community treatment orders, that's a kind of mirror side. Anyway, let's read some shit on the internet. Shall we open up this research paper for today? There's me in the corner, not losing my religion, etc., etc. If you have one, I hope that yours serves you well. Institutional confinement and privatisation economics, an analysis of the UK criminal justice and forensic psychiatric systems. The architecture of institutional confinement in the United Kingdom operates at the highly complex intersection of criminal justice, public health, and free market economics. The state's authority to deprive an individual of their liberty is executed through dual parallel frameworks. On one side exists the penal system, historically defined by statutory sentencing guidelines and a paradigm of retributive and rehabilitative justice. On the other side exists the forensic psychiatric system, governed predominantly by the Mental Health Act 1983 or 2025, I think it was actually repealed or rewritten or some shit, which operates under a paradigm of therapeutic intervention, clinical treatability, and risk management. As successive governments have increasingly integrated private sector providers into both domains over the last 3 decades, a deeply entrenched nexus has emerged between the legal mechanisms that authorise confinement and the corporate economic models that finance its execution. This report provides an exhaustive, objective analysis of these intersecting domains. It first delineates the defective boundary of prison incarceration against the indefinite nature of psychiatric detention, examining how different statutory frameworks produce divergent durations of confinement for analogous offences. It then extensively analyses the privatisation loss metric, an economic framework used to qualify the leakage of public funds into private capital within outsourced institutional settings, evaluating the subsequent corollary impacts on operational quality and the bureaucratic gaming of performance indicators. Finally, The analysis evaluates the systemic integrity of these institutions, researching the evidence of structural corruption, conflict of interest, and the revolving door phenomenon concerning patient and inpatient placements within the outsourced custodial and psychiatric estate. So legal frameworks, the definitive boundary versus indefinite detention. The fundamental distinction between the UK's penal system and its forensic psychiatric system lies in the statutory mechanisms dictating the duration and the absolute limits of a subject's deprivation of liberty. While the modern criminal justice system is largely predicated on determinate boundaries and proportionate sentencing, the psychiatric system relies on ongoing clinical assessment of risk, inherently resulting in indeterminate periods of confinement. The definitive boundaries, the determinate prison sentencing. The mainstream penal system is anchored by the principle of determinate sentencing. What that means is that the definitive boundary of prison incarceration is established at the point of sentencing by the judiciary, providing the offender with a fixed statutory endpoint to their custodial term when they get out of prison. In recent years, acute capacity crisis within the penal state have forced legislative adjustments to these boundaries to accelerate population churn, whatever that means. We used to call gurners churners. Make your stomach churn a bit sometimes, and mandy. Anyway, and manage severe overcrowding. For example, under the SDS40 policy implementation, eligible prisoners serving standard determinate sentences are released into the community on licences at the 40% mark of their sentence rather than the traditional 50% milestone. As of late 2024, the total prison population in England and Wales stood at 85,372, demonstrating a slight decrease, primarily attributed to these emergency early release mechanisms. These mechanisms underscore the rigidity of the penal boundary. The state is likely to be legally compelled to release the individual once the statutory milestone is reached, irrespective of holistic assessment of their total rehabilitation or complete risk elimination, provided scientific licence conditions can be set and monitored by the probation service. This rigid boundary creates a highly predictable flow of inmates, though one heavily influenced by macro-level sentencing trends. Recent analysis indicate that the average prison sentence length is substantially longer now than it was 25 years ago, a trend driven by increasing punitive legislation. Former senior judges in England and Wales have publicly critiqued this escalation, noting that the doubling of sentence lengths over recent decades lacks empirical justification regarding the reduction of reoffending and serves primarily to inflate the custodial population. The legacy of indeterminacy, imprisonment for public protection. While the penal system is inherently determinate, it was historically experimented with indefinite confinement, most notably through the imprisonment for public protection (IPP) sentence, introduced to replace automatic life sentences for repeated serious offending. IPPs could be imposed if the court concluded that the offender posted a significant risk or serious harm to the public. Release was not tied to a definitive boundary, rather it was entirely contingent upon satisfying the parole board that the risk of harm had been significantly reduced. The IPP sentence effectively blurred the lines between definitive penal incarceration and indefinite risk-based detention. The formula for presuming dangerousness under IPP regime was heavily criticised for being excessively prescriptive, infringing upon judicial discretion and placing unmanageable assessment pressures on both the parole board and the prison service. As a result, far more IPP sentences were passed by the courts than initially modelled by policymakers, leading to severe logistical pressures across the estate. Although the IPP sentence was formally abolished due to near universal criticism, the legacy of this indefinite penal experiment persists acutely. As of December 24, there remained 1,000 unreleased prisoners serving IPP sentences. These individuals remain trapped in a state of indeterminacy, originally designed to mirror the risk management functions of the forensic psychiatric system, lacking the definitive boundary that characterises the remainder of the determinate penal estate. The Indefinite Paradigm, Part 3 of the Mental Health Act 1983. In stark contrast to determining penal sentencing, the Mental Health Act 1983 provides the legal foundation for the detention of individuals suffering from a mental disorder if they're judged to present a risk of harm to themselves or to others. The MHA is structured to balance a patient's right to autonomy against the state's duty of care and the right to society to protection. While over 2/3 of individuals detained under the Mental Health Act are held under Part 2 of the Act, which applies to civil patients with no involvement in the criminal justice system, Part 3 governs forensic patients who are in criminal proceedings or under active sentence. Section 3 is basically a treatment order. I'm on a Section 3, but it's, doesn't necessarily mean that you're involved in criminal proceedings or active sentence, but you will be put on a Section 3 if you are, just to be clear on that. Less than 1/3 of people recorded as in hospital detention are detained under Part 3, yet this cohort represents the most complex intersection of state punishment and therapeutic care. When an individual is convicted of a crime punishable by imprisonment, the criminal courts possess the authority to issue a hospital order under Section 37 of the Mental Health Act, provided the individual suffers from a mental disorder necessitating hospital treatment. This hospital order functions as a sentence, but critically does not possess a fixed end date. The duration of confinement is entirely contingent upon the individual's clinical progress, their response to pharmacological, psychopharmacological or therapeutic intervention, and the continuous assessment of their ongoing risk to the public. To compound the indefinite nature of this detention, the courts frequently apprehend a restriction order under Section 41 of the Mental Health Act. When a Section 3741 restriction order is applied, the authority to grant leave of absence or to authorise inter-hospital transfer or ultimately discharge the patient is legally removed from the responsible clinician and transferred directly to the Secretary of State for Justice. Restricted patients can only be definitively discharged from a hospital by a first-tier mental health tribunal or the Secretary of State, rather than by independent medical practitioners acting alone. Dual oversight mechanism effectively fuses clinical psychiatric assessments with political and public imperatives. The tribunal itself represents a significant hurdle to the restoration of liberty. Data from the Care Quality Commission indicates that approximately 30 to 37, it's a bit of a stark statistic, isn't it? Somewhere between 30 and 37% of appeals by restricted patients result in some form of discharge decision. So somewhere between 73 and 70. The tribunal orders a conditional discharge which leaves the individual subject to long-term community monitoring, compulsory psychiatric oversight, and the perpetual threat of immediate recall to secure hospital facilities. The tension between definitive and indefinite confinement is further illustrated by the mechanism of prison to hospital transfers under Section 47 of the Mental Health Act, which can also be accompanied by a restriction order under Section 49. If an inmate reaches their definitive sentence expiry date while detained under Section 47 or 49, but is deemed to still require psychiatric treatment, their legal status converts. The restriction drops away, but they remain indefinitely detained under the civil provisions of the Mental Health Act, such as Section 3, effectively dissolving the definitive boundary of their original penal sentence and replacing it with an open-ended clinical detention. So, comparative temporal disparities in confinement. This bit talks about the practical manifestation of these divergent legal frameworks becoming evident when comparing the actual length of the stay for individuals who've committed similar offences but have been routed into different institutional pathways. Because the MHA relies on clinical recovery, risk mitigation and systemic capacity rather than proportionate retribution, patients can be subjected to deprivations of liberty that vastly exceed the maximum statutory prison sentence for equivalent crimes. A rigorous archival cross-section study by Tomlin et al. Analysed this phenomenon by computing the length of stay, LOS, in a Polish medium security hospital against the duration of imprisonment for perpetrators of non-homicide violent crimes. The exclusion of homicide and attempted homicide was methodologically necessary, as these crimes typically attract mandatory or exceptionally long sentences, for example 25 years, which would severely distort the comparative data regarding flexible sentencing. The findings confirmed significant multi-directional disparities in the length of time individuals spent in closed institutions based on solely the nature of the facility and the governing legal framework. Here's that chart, offence category, mean length of stay in hospital, stay in prison, statistical disparity. That's that. So comparing secure hospitalisation versus prison sentences for similar offences among male perpetrators. So, so you're looking at slightly more, almost double there, 30 to 73 months, 38 months, less on that one and less on that one. So yeah, not that really. The data indicates that for offences such as stalking, threats and general mistreatment, male patients spent nearly twice as long confined to a hospital than men sentenced to imprisonment for identical behavioural interactions. The underlying psychiatric diagnosis for these individuals, predominantly schizophrenia spectrum disorders, 61% of them, brain injury syndromes, 16%, and delusional disorders, 12.2%, dictate a clinical trajectory that is wholly divorced from the penal concept of a statutorily lesser crime. Because the clinical condition is chronic or slow to respond to treatment, the detention is prolonged far beyond what penal proportionality would allow. I can't really read very well. I'm on clonazepam. It's making my speech go all shit. Conversely, men hospitalised following sexual offences were confined for over 3 years less than those sentenced to prison. This divergence highlights a profound systemic reality. The therapeutic state exercises a much longer hold on offenders whose crimes stem from intractable complex psychiatric conditions, while the punitive state exercises a longer hold on offenders whose crimes violate profound social taboos, such as sexual violence, irrespective of clinical treatability. Furthermore, the overall mean length of stay for all patients in the secure hospital unit was calculated at 39.1 months. However, the researchers noted that the figure likely underestimates the total deprivation of liberty. Forensic patients frequently transition through multi-tiered security model, requiring substantial additional time, often a minimum of 6 months, in low security units prior to community discharge. In the UK context, progression through the forensic estate is frequently characterised by profound delays that artificially inflate the length of the stay. Data on forensic mental health services indicates that high-risk patients spend an extended time progressing downward through descending levels of security, with transfers between services subject to significant administrative and capacity-related bottlenecks. The CQC has explicitly warned that the inability to move restricted patients into a step-down ward or community placements has a severe negative impact, keeping patients in wards that are no longer clinically appropriate and subjecting them to more restrictive conditions than necessary. The indefinite nature of psychiatric detention, therefore, is driven not solely by pathology, but by systemic friction and capacity failures within the wider health and social care ecosystem. I'm on a PQ and they're going to just discharge me back into the community, apparently, instead of stepping down to an acute ward or a rehab. The next paragraph is entitled "The Economics of Confinement, the Privatisation Loss Metric." As populations within both the penal and psychiatric systems expanded over recent decades, successive governments increasingly turned to the private sector to finance, construct and operate these facilities. This structural shift precipitated the emergence of a systemic economic phenomenon referred to as the privatisation loss metric. The quantifiable capital extracted from public sector funding that's diverted into private profits, debt servicing and shareholder dividends, rather than being reinvested into service delivery or operational quality, defining and quantifying financial leakage. So the financialisation of social care, of mental health, and of custodial services has transformed the human need in legal confinement into highly lucrative, low-risk investment opportunities for global capital. This structural shift relies heavily on contracting models such as the Private Finance Initiative, which were utilised extensively by both Blair and Brown governments to increase capacity under the premise that private sector competition would drive up standards and promote efficiencies. However, empirical and parliamentary evidence demonstrates a profound structural leakage of public funds. So under PFI contracts, public sector finance typically covers up to 90% of the initial capital outlay, making the projects liable to borrowing costs that are significantly higher than the rates available for standard government borrowing. The architecture of these contracts relies upon special purpose vehicles, SPVs, which serve as opaque corporate entities designed to hold the assets and manage the financial flows of a specific project. SPVs inherently generate multiple opportunities for revenue leakage. For example, once the construction stage of a facility is completed, the SPV can frequently negotiate the interest of its loans with financial institutions in recognition of the reduced risk profile. Theoretically, under revised models like PF2, these savings should be split with the public sector, but in practice, these reductions rarely cascade back to the taxpayer. Instead, shareholders frequently extract between 10 and 15% interest on their subordinated loans to SPVs alongside substantial dividend payouts, resulting in PFI funded contracts that may ultimately be twice as expensive as those funded directly by the state. This extraction of capital represents a direct transfer of wealth from the public purse to global investors. Academic and economic research focusing on the outsourcing of Scottish public services provides a conservative estimate that between £2 and £3 billion a year is diverted from the public sector into private profits and other extraction mechanisms. In the context of private psychiatric care and residential support, financial analysis of corporate operators reveals exceptional profit generation. For instance, the corporate entity Adefica reported an earnings before interest and taxes EBIT margin of 83%, equating to £5,600 per resident per year, or £108 a week in clear profit, capital that's entirely removed from the care ecosystem. This model creates a profound negative multiplier effect on the local and national economy. Direct public employment represents the shortest economic supply chain, where public sector workers spend their wages locally. Conversely, the privatisation model exports revenue out of the local economy to satisfy global debt repayments and shareholder dividends. When portions of public budgets are strictly ring-fenced to service these inflexible contract payments, public authorities lose operational flexibility. Consequently, the preventative neighbourhood and health services are frequently sacrificed to maintain the annual donation to private investors' profits. Loads of hashtags there, fuck knows why. The impact of the profit motive on the workforce and operational quality. So these savings touted by private operators during the bidding process are almost universally achieved at the direct expense of the workforce and operational overheads. Basic salaries for custodial officers in private prisons have historically been measured at nearly a third lower than those in the public sector, coupled with longer working weeks, interior pension schemes, and diminished holiday entitlements. The Trades Union Congress, TUC, and the Prison Reform Trust, PRT, have documented that private prisons operate with significantly fewer staff per prisoner, historically up to 17% fewer than their public sector equivalents. By suppressing wages and excluding workers from robust public pension schemes, the private sector effectively socialises the long-term costs of its workforce. The state is subsequently forced to subsidise these low wages through the in-work benefit system and bear the long-term societal costs of post-treatment poverty. The privatisation loss metric is not merely a financial abstraction. It has severe quantifiable impacts on the quality of care and the safety of custodial environments. A comprehensive meta-analysis conducted by researchers at the University of Oxford, examining 13 longitudinal studies across high-income countries, definitively concluded that hospitals converting from public to private ownership typically deliver worse quality care. The research identified that the increased profits generated by privatised health facilities were primarily achieved through two distinct operational strategies: aggressive staff reductions and the selective intake of patients. Privatisation consistently corresponded with reduced overall staffing levels, particularly among auxiliary and cleaning staff. So this reduction was directly and causally linked to a higher rate of healthcare associated patient infections. In certain studies evaluated within the meta-analysis, higher levels of hospital privatisation corresponded with extended rates of avoidable patient deaths. That's pretty dark, isn't it? The findings comprehensively challenge the prevailing justification that market completion and patient-centric private frameworks inherently improve service quality. Similar operational degradation is evident within the privatised penal state. The deliberate suppression of the workforce to drive profit margins results in compromised safety protocols, heightened vulnerability of both staff and inmates, and exceptional staff turnover rates are frequently double those seen in the public sector. In 24-25, almost 50% of all prisoners were judged by HM's Prison and Probation Service to have concerning or seriously concerning performance. A marked deterioration from previous years, with the average cost of a prisoner rising to 53 grand per year. The failure of the private sector to deliver commensurate value is stark. The fundamental tension remains unresolved. Those operating facilities for commercial profit possess an inherent fiduciary duty to their shareholders to minimise operational expenditures, a mandate that stands in direct opposition to the resource-intensive requirements of therapeutic care and safe custodial rehabilitation. Performance measurement and systemic gaming. To manage the inherent risks of outsourcing, the state relies upon highly complex, standardised performance measurement frameworks and key performance indicators to monitor private contractors. However, the imposition of these frameworks frequently generates unintended consequences, most notably the phenomenon of systemic gaming. When the survival and profitability of a private contract are tethered to specific metrics, the operators are strongly incentivised to manipulate the data or alter operational parameters to artificially inflate their performance ratings. Understandable conflict of interest, really. This results in a bureaucratic environment where facility leadership focuses aggressively on optimising their ranking rather than undertaking substantive system-wide reforms. Research conducted by the London School of Economics, the Quad Project, highlighted that standardised ratings in English prisons will create gaming disengagement and bureaucratisation within the prison private sector. This gaming can manifest in several ways. For instance, reconviction rates, a crude metric heavily reliant on post-release socio-economic factors largely outside of prison's direct control, as something's manipulated by private operators seeking to establish partnerships with post-release job placement programs selectively located in areas with weaker local policing. Therefore, thereby, it claims, I don't know if I agree with that, artificially depressing the rate at which former inmates are officially caught reoffending. Just because you go to a rough end, it doesn't mean you're going to commit a crime, does it really? But there we are. Furthermore, private operators frequently engage in patient shuffling or selective intake to ensure their facilities are populated by individuals who are cheaper to manage and less likely to trigger contractual penalties. Historical reports from Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons have highlighted instances where private therapeutic communities such as Dovegate appear to skew their selection processes to favour prisoners from within their own main prison over those on external waiting lists, seemingly to satisfy specific contractual volume requirements rather than addressing genuine clinical need. This selective intake ensures that the private sector manages the most profitable and least complex demographics, while the public sector is left as the provider of last resort forced to manage the most volatile, highest risk and costliest populations with an increasingly underfunded and overcrowded estate. Systemic integrity and corruption risk in institutional placement. So the intersection of state authority, vulnerable populations, and immense corporate capital creates an environment uniquely susceptible to systemic corruption. While the mechanisms of corruption within the UK differ substantially from the overt bribery observed in other jurisdictions, the structural vulnerabilities remain profound, particularly concerning the placements of individuals into profit-generating institutions and the awarding of the contracts that govern them. So the revolving door and regulatory capture. The inquiry into whether there is evidence of corruption regarding the placement of individuals into private institutions requires a careful definition of corruption. Over in the States, this risk materialised most infamously as the Kids for Cash scandal, where federal courts convicted 2 judges for accepting over $2 million in kickbacks from developers of private juvenile detention centres. Mental. In exchange, the judges routinely impose harsh custodial sentences on youths to ensure the facilities remain populated and highly profitable. Within the United Kingdom, there's a distinctive lack of documented evidence or investigative reporting indicating direct transactional bribery of the judiciary to facilitate specific placements into private prisons or psychiatric hospitals. Maybe they're all just Freemasons. However, the absence of direct bribery does not equate to an absence of structural corruption. The primary vulnerability in the UK context is the revolving door phenomenon, the seamless movement of high-ranking civil servants, regulatory officials, and occasionally judicial figures into lucrative advisory or board positions within the very private entities they previously regulated or awarded contracts to. So put loads of people in prison, Mr. Judge, and we'll give you a 6-figure salary job. Lovely jubbly. Nice bit of bread and butter. Transparency International UK, TRUK, has repeatedly highlighted that poor controls over the revolving door risk compromising the integrity of public procurement and threaten to undermine public trust. The UK private prison market operates essentially as an oligopoly, overwhelmingly dominated by just 3 multinational corporations: G4S, Serco, and Sodexo. The fluidity with which personal transition between the Ministry of Justice and these corporate entities introduces profound conflict of interest risks. The economic framework explaining this vulnerability is the market expansion theory. This theory posits that regulations or government officials contemplating their future exit into the private sector possess an underlying motive to increase the market demand for the services which they will eventually be providing. By expanding the reach of the outsourced regulatory regime, such as championing the privatisation of the probation service or authorising the construction of new PFI prisons, officials secure a larger, more lucrative private sector into which they can eventually transition. Makes sense, really, doesn't it? This dynamic fosters regulatory capture, where the boundaries between the state and the corporate provider dissolve. The consequences of this proximity become glaringly evident when analysing the state's response to corporate malfeasance. For example, G4S and Serco, Google them if you don't know who they are. Serco's massive company, was subject to prolonged investigation by the Serious Fraud Office regarding their electronic monitoring contacts with the Ministry of Justice. It was discovered the companies had dishonestly misled the MOJ regarding the true extent of their profits to avoid contractual obligations to share cost reductions, and had systemically billed the taxpayer for the tracking of individuals who had moved abroad, returned to prison, or even passed away. In 2013, the then Minister Chris Grayling requested the SFO investigate these invoicing practices. Both companies entered into deferred prosecution agreements with the SFO. Serco paid out 20 million quid, and the Serious Fraud Office costs of another 4 million, while G4S faced similar punitive measures. However, despite these massive systemic frauds, the oligopoly remained largely intact. During the height of the investigations, the Howard League for Penal Reform protested the minister's decision to allow G4S and Serco to rapidly resume bidding for massive government justice contracts. while the Serious Fraud Office inquiry was still happening. Fucked up, eh? The state's continued reliance on these identical providers for the management of the custodial estate indicates a level of systemic dependency that eventually blunts the government's ability to hold private actors accountable or to enforce meaningful punitive action for contractual breaches. So, vested interests and institutional placement vulnerabilities. The creation of a private profit-driven custodial sector intrinsically generates a vested corporate interest in the continuous growth of the prison and forensic psychiatric populations. Because the revenue of these firms often depend upon maintaining high occupancy rates, any policy aimed at reducing the risk with the use of imprisonment directly threatens corporate profitability. As noticed by the Prison Reform Trust, it's deeply contradictory for a state to commit to reducing unnecessary incarceration while at the same time simultaneously creating an economic infrastructure that actually relies upon high incarceration rates to satisfy global shareholders, as well as their new employees, from the judiciary. While direct judicial manipulation of individual placements is not evident in the UK, the broader systemic architecture ensures that private companies are the primary beneficiaries of punitive sentencing trends. So that's a fact. The recent legislative skills that have actively doubled the lengths of many sentences guarantee the expansion of the penal population, which in turn necessitates the continual commissioning of new private estate facilities. This macro-level expansion effectively secures the future revenue streams of the dominant private providers. Within the forensic psychiatric sector, the placement pipeline is similarly fraught with economic friction. NHS commissioners rely on providers such as the Priory Group and Signet Healthcare to accommodate the overflow of complex mental health patients, particularly in Tier 4 child and adolescent mental health services and highly specialised adult wards. The lack of public capacity forces the state to effectively outsource its statutory duty of care, while placements into these facilities are governed by clinical need rather than judicial mandate. The underlying economic reality is that private psychiatric hospitals derive substantial profits from maintaining high occupancy, so it's in their interests. The systemic delay in discharging restricted patients, often due to lack of step-down community facilities, traps individuals in highly restricted, highly profitable private inpatient settings for years longer than clinically necessary. CQC reported instances where patients remained on wards for nearly a year when the clinical average length of stay should have been 2 to 3 months. In this scenario, the state is effectively held hostage by a capacity crisis of its own making, forced to pay premium rates to private entities that has no inherent financial incentive to accelerate the patient's transition back into the underfunded public community system. Operational corruption within outsourced environments. The downstream effect of the privatisation loss metric, specifically the systemic underpayment and under-resourcing of frontline staff, creates exceptionally fertile ground for operational corruption within the walls of the institutions themselves. Prisons are closed worlds with minimal continuous external scrutiny, where the daily exercise of power presents constant opportunities for abuse. When institutional loyalty and the public service ethos are eroded by low pay scales and inferior working conditions, staff become significantly more susceptible to coercion, bribery, and the sub-rosa economies that dominate custodial environments. Recent operational data reveals a sharp, alarming escalation in the number of prison staff investigated for corruption and inappropriate relationships with inmates. Between 2020 and 2023, the number of staff probed for inappropriate relationships surged from 51 to 144. Experts attribute this surge directly to the ongoing recruitment and retention crisis within overcrowded facilities, which has forced private and public operators to recruit highly inexperienced staff, described as teenagers with no work experience beyond Saturday jobs, to manage some of the most challenging and volatile demographics in the country. The combination of poorly paid, highly inexperienced personnel and an incarcerated population with an access to illicit external assets creates a profoundly vulnerable security environment. The systemic inability, I've got some vape, to adequately police this internal corruption was starkly illustrated by the historical scandal at Pentonville Prison. A massive independent investigation into alleged staff corruption resulted in the suspension of dozens of officers and the expenditure of several £1 million. Out of 31 suspected officers, the investigation ultimately collapsed due to the gross mishandling of confidentiality by the investigators and profound institutional incompetence, resulting in 0 proven corruption charges and the reinstatement of previously convicted staff. Fucked up. This systemic failure underscores the institutional fragility of the oversight apparatus. When the state delegates the management of human confinement to private entities incentivised to obscure operational failures to protect their contractual standing, the detection and prosecution of systemic corruption becomes structurally impeded. While there's no empirical evidence to suggest that private prison staff systematically manufacture physical altercations or fabricate disciplinary procedures to artificially extend inmate stays, the opacity of the internal adjudication processes and the intense pressure to satisfy commercial KPIs ensure that the theoretical risk of procedural manipulation remains a constant but latent threat to the integrity of the custodial estate. In conclusion, the mechanisms of institutional confinement in the United Kingdom represent a profound intersection of legal philosophy and market economics. The statutory frameworks governing the deprivation of liberty are fundamentally divergent. The penal system operates on an axis of definitive, determinate boundaries, modified only by emergency capacity measures, while the forensic psychiatric system, governed by the Mental Health Act, relies upon indefinite risk-based containment subject to political oversight. This dichotomy produces severe temporal disparities, wherein the therapeutic state frequently imposes significantly longer deprivations of liberty for specific offences than the punitive state, highlighting the intractable complexities of merging clinical treatment with public protection. Superimposed on these legal frameworks is an economic model defined by extensive privatisation. The outsourcing of the penal and psychiatric estates has generated a massive privatisation loss metric, authorising the extraction of billions of pounds in public funds to service private debt and shareholder dividends. The empirical evidence overwhelmingly suggests that this financial extraction is achieved at the direct expense of operational quality, manifesting in suppressed staffing ratios, deteriorating health outcomes and higher infection rates, and the proliferation of opaque corporate entities that game performance metrics to protect their profit margins while leaving the public sector to manage the most complex and costly populations. Furthermore, while the United Kingdom does not exhibit the overt transactional judicial bribery seen in foreign jurisdictions regarding the direct placement of inmates, its systems are heavily compromised by structural corruption. The oligopolistic dominance of a few multinational providers, coupled with the systemic revolving door between government regulators and corporate boards, fosters an environment of regulatory capture. This capture severely blunts the state's ability to penalise corporate fraud and ensures a continuous pipeline of privatised capacity. By transforming the deprivation of human liberty into a tradable, profit-generating commodity, the state's fundamentally altered the incentives governing institutional confinement, ensuring that the expansion of the custodial and psychiatric estate serves not merely the interest of justice and public health, but the relentless financial imperatives of global capital.